If you collect retro video game consoles, you have no doubt run into some that have yellowed over the years. This generally is caused by the process of adding bromine to the plastic formulation as a flame-resistant measure. All I know is that it can be a real eyesore. Over the years, we have seen many techniques of removing the yellow tint with a method called Retrobrite. This method uses hydrogen peroxide solution and a reagent to chemically restore the plastic's original color. In this episode, we will be attempting the Sous Vide variation of this method on an original Game Boy shell. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. In today's refurb episode, we're going to refurbish this weathered Game Boy DMG that, if you remember, I picked this up on eBay from Japan. If you do want to see that pickups video, you can click on the link at the top of your screen or in the description below. So the restoration of this particular Game Boy, I'm probably going to span over 2 to maybe 3 episodes. This first episode is going to be solely focused on restoring and refurbishing the shell of this DMG. As you can see, it has yellowed quite a bit and is in dire need of a thorough cleaning. So the method I'll be using to de-yellow the shell is a process called retrobriting. Now, some of you may be familiar with this process, and essentially what it is it uses hydrogen peroxide or hydrogen peroxide solution. I'll be using this 40 volume salon grade peroxide cream, and what it does is it uses that along with UV light. Typically people leave it in the sun in order to restore the original color of plastics that have yellowed over the years. So you may have seen videos online on how to do this, and a lot of the times the people making those videos, they would leave these out in the sun for several hours, and that was sort of how they got the reaction in order to restore the original color. So my issue with that method of retrobriting is that there are a lot of variables that are out of your control. Variables such as the weather, whether or not the sun is out, the time of day, the season, and even your general location. Depending on those variables, your results for retrobriting may vary. So this brings me to a newer method that maybe in the last few years has become more popular. It was recently sort of, I guess you could say, discovered that heat is another method to sort of create the reaction to de-yellow the plastic. And one of the ways to apply heat is by putting it in a basin of water that's been heated to a very precise temperature, which brings me to this new method. This new method uses what is called a sous vide precision cooker. And that's what this is. This is what they call a sous vide. And what this device does is it precisely heats water to a very precise temperature that you set. And of course, this is actually used for cooking. It's not meant for retrobriting, but some people have used this to generally what appears to be pretty good results, just because of the way this heats the water. It circulates the water and it keeps the entire basin at a constant, precise temperature. So what I like about the sous vide method is that it is very repeatable. You can do it at any time, and you can do it in any environment and any location. So here are the tools and items you'll need to do this refurb. Please feel free to pause the screen so you can take note of them. Okay, so that's everything you need. Now, before we can start, obviously I think what we need to do is establish a baseline. So what I mean by that is it's kind of hard to tell in a vacuum the actual color of this DMG. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what a sort of clean Nintendo DMG looks like. This is a backlit and biverted Game Boy, but you can tell the shell here is pretty good, but of course, this is much nicer looking than this unit. And also for comparison, I have here this classic Game Boy Pocket, which I refurbed in another video. If you do want to see that video, you can click on the link at the top of your screen. I'll also leave it in the description below. But this classic Game Boy Pocket sort of mimics the color that the DMG should be. And again, I'm going to leave that here just for comparison purposes. And I'll of course take pictures of this because we do want to see if we're getting good results using this method. And of course, again, before we can get started, we're going to need to disassemble this Game Boy completely to just the shell. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to do that first. All right, to get started, we're first going to remove the 6 Phillips screws on the back of the console. This is an early model DMG, so all the screws on this unit are actually Phillips. So your particular unit may be different from mine and have some tri-wing screws. All right, with all the screws removed, we can separate the two halves. Now be careful because we do need to remove the ribbon cable connecting the front and the rear half of the console. With the two separated, we're going to start with the rear half and remove the 4 Phillips screws securing the motherboard and the audio board to the rear shell. And as you know, I like to label all my screws, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to do that. So when we put it all together, we can put all the screws where we got them from. All right, so the motherboard actually looks pretty good, but the rear shell is extremely dirty, so we're gonna really need to give this a good clean. So next we're gonna remove the RF shield, and we're gonna do that by removing the 4 Phillips screws. All right. And then take out the power switch cover. And so the last thing we're going to do is remove the 3 battery terminals from the shell. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to stick these in distilled white vinegar to remove the corrosion, because as you can see, especially with this terminal, it is extremely corroded, and it could be the issue with why this DMG isn't turning on. Alright, so now let's move to the front half of the shell, and we're going to need to remove 10 Phillips screws securing it to the front shell housing. Alright, so with all the screws removed, we can set the front board aside, and the condition actually looks pretty good on this unit, so I'm pretty happy with that. But the speaker is going to need to be cleaned. Alright, so remove the membranes and the buttons from the front shell housing and set them aside. So next we're going to remove the screen lens, and actually this just popped out with very little pressure. And here we have the front shell housing and the rear shell housing, as well as the battery door cover. And before we move forward, I'm going to try and remove the adhesive that was holding the screen lens on by using some isopropyl alcohol to use as a solvent to sort of break down the old adhesive. Now, I was having a really hard time doing this, no matter how much IPA I was using, so I ended up using a metal spudger to sort of scrape the old adhesive off. And that seemed to work pretty good, being careful not to really scratch the plastic, but it doesn't really matter because it's going to be covered by the screen lens anyway. Alright, so now that we're done, we're going to go ahead and give this a deep clean in some warm soapy water. So we're going to go ahead and put everything in and give it a good scrub with a toothbrush. I was using a toothpick to get to the hard to reach places that had some gunk that I wanted to get out. And as you can see from the water just is totally dirty. So this unit really did need a very deep clean. Alright, so once we gave it the initial clean, we're going to get some fresh water to rinse off all of the soap that is on the shell. And I actually am going to clean the rear battery cover and the start select button because I forgot to do that initially. So we're taking care of that now. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set all these pieces aside to dry. All right, we're going to clean our workstation up and we're going to prepare the front and rear shell housing with some peroxide cream. So just pour a little bit of peroxide cream onto the shell, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to try and spread it evenly so that it gets good contact when we heat it in the water basin. So you can use a toothbrush to help with this process. And once we have enough peroxide on the shell, we're going to go ahead and put each one individually in their own plastic bag. Alright, with that all set, we're going to go ahead and prep our workstation for the sous vide. So grab a large pot or container to hold water, and we're going to go ahead and place the front and rear shell housing into the water basin. Now, I was having a hard time, so these were floating, so I used a weight to weigh them down, and then we heated the water to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, and we let it sit for 3 hours. All right, so after 3 hours, we can go ahead and we can take everything out. So as you can see right there, I do have the weight holding down the front and rear shell housing so that it remains submerged in the water. Alright, so here you can see we still have the front rear shell housing in the bags with the peroxide cream. So we're going to go ahead, I'm going to remove that and give them a good clean before we proceed. Alright, so we did the Sous Vide Retrobrite, and I do think the results are okay. I think we could have left it in the basin of water a little bit longer. But I do think we were overall able to moderately brighten the shell a little bit. Maybe if I left it in for 4 to 5 hours, we would have gotten a slightly better result. So just for comparison purposes, here is the biverted DMG that I modded, and the Game Boy Pocket Classic. So there you sort of have it. These were the items we compared. And I don't know if you can tell, but it was lightened a little bit, and I think maybe part of the issue was that I didn't use hydrogen peroxide liquid like the person did on the Desk Authority website, and I think that might have been a little bit better because with that you do ensure contact with the hydrogen peroxide, and I think there's a better heat transfer since the whole bag is filled with liquid. Whereas I did have air bubbles because I used the cream and I relied on the plastic sort of touching the cream and the surface of the Game Boy shell, and it may have not been a perfect contact. So I do think that, and you can kind of see here on the bottom here, there was a little bit, the color is pretty dark here. I should have used this as a baseline, but yeah, overall, you know, I'm kind of happy with the results. I don't think I'm going to do the retrobriting again. I think I'm just going to live with the way this looks. It's obviously significantly cleaner. I thoroughly cleaned the shell, removed all the adhesive here, and I think it's going to still be a pretty cool build. And you know, and maybe in the future I might reshell it. But overall, a moderate success. It did sort of lighten it a little bit. For now, I think it's, you know, not too bad, and we're going to sort of continue on with the build. And fortunately enough, initially the Game Boy wasn't working, and while I was doing this whole Retrobrite process, I actually took the contacts and I put them in distilled white vinegar for basically the entire duration of this process, so about 3 hours, and I kind of give them a good scrub with a metal wire brush, and I plugged it in. I put the contacts back in the shell. I put the motherboard back in. I tried it again, and lo and behold, it worked. So the problem with the Game Boy was that there was a lot of corrosion on the contacts. So I was expecting to potentially have to repair the switch or replace all the capacitors. I don't have to do that, thankfully. So yeah, for the next episode, we're gonna go ahead and do the RIPS version 2 IPS mod on this Game Boy DMG. So if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. I do release content every Thursday, and as always, we'll see you next time.